US-Guyana to the world.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Globespan. My name is Rusat Ramgopal. I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion. We're joined by an esteemed panel of guests: Grant Lawley, a former nominee for U.S. Congress; Paul King, a current nominee for U.S. Congress; and Mr. Timothy Jonas. You all know him as a esteemed senior counsel and General Secretary of ANOG in Guyana, the third party. So we are pleasured and enjoy the panelists gathered here tonight. We will be discussing the updates with regard to Guyana, Venezuela, as well as the US-Guyana relationship, how the politics in each country can affect that. Now, before beginning the discussion, that Mr. Jonas asked me off air, why are we talking about Guyana, Venezuela again? And I wanted to begin tonight by saying exactly why we're talking about it. This is an issue that everybody was talking about a few months ago when it was heating up. Thankfully, tensions cooled down. But now nobody's talking about it, except the fact that there was a think tank called the CSIS that continues to report on it. It reported on the crisis in December. It reported on it in February when it noticed satellite imagery of Venezuela conducting a military buildup. When it reported on it in February, we had the author of that report on Globespan here to discuss that report. We had Mr. Jones and Mr. Lawley on that discussion as well. CNN, global media covered that report. But the local Guyanese media did not cover that report as much. But the report was troubling. It's very serious issues being discussed there. The Venezuela's buildup around Ankoko Island. Now there was an update to that report again in the end of May. The CSIS has published updated satellite imagery of Venezuela's continued military buildup, not just in terms of manpower, but also in terms of military machinery, helicopters, missiles, ships, boats. And we are currently in the lead up to the Venezuelan election, which will happen just in a matter of weeks in the month of July. And at that point, that's when Maduro may be at his riskiest or most unpredictable. That's why the report has been published recently that warns the international community to remain vigilant, keep an eye on Venezuela, and not take the eye off Venezuela. Following the publishing of that report by the CSIS, there's been global media coverage by CNN, by the Miami Herald, but we do not see much coverage amongst Guyanese media. That's why I wanted, when I had the opportunity tonight to host, to talk about this again, because it is a very important issue. And Devin, if you could put up some of the images of first what the CSIS put out, and then we'll go into some of the coverage. So yeah, so you can see here, this is some of the satellite imagery of Venezuela's military buildup in the Essequibo. This is the complete military installation at Ankoko Island. Ankoko Island military base, Ankoko Island river crossing site.
Piece of paper or not.
And it's important to pay attention to a crisis before it happens, not after, and be caught flat-footed. If some people may remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't happen because John F. Kennedy, got a call saying that from the Soviets saying, "Hey, we have weapons in Cuba." It happened because Kennedy's intelligence took satellite imagery and told him, this is what's happening in Cuba. be prepared for what the Soviets may do. So it's important to pay attention to these reports, satellite imagery, before a crisis builds up, not just afterwards. And if you could put up the image from The Atlantic, Kevin. The Atlantic magazine was a very famous magazine. In its coverage here, it says, "Is Venezuela serious about invading Guyana?" Obviously, most people, when reading that, would say, no, they're not serious about invading Guyana. But as the magazine points out, then again, a war between the two Latin American states is nearly unimaginable. Then again, so was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the report does make clear to point out how unlikely an invasion of Guyana is, but Maduro, again, is a madman figure at the point where he may lose power, and it warns of the risk of him manufacturing a crisis, and that's what leaders in these situations may do. So as a result of that, that's why I wanted to focus tonight's discussion on that, and importantly, the US-Guyana relationship in response to it. Guyana has the benefit of having a large diaspora population in the United States, and if that diaspora population, as a voting bloc, makes their issues and concerns heard, they can have an impact, just like many other groups over time. I mean, when you look, for example, at the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the respective diaspora groups, ethnic groups, make their voices heard as voting blocs in the United States. You look historically at the Irish peace process. The Irish Americans made themselves a powerful voting bloc and had their voices heard on that issue, and that's why the U.S. played an important role in the Irish peace process later on. If the Guyanese community was a united voting bloc and woke up, the American politicians and the American political process would have to wake up to the concerns of Guyanese Americans on that issue as well. So I know I had a long opening monologue there, but it's on that premise that we have tonight's discussion, and we are joined by a wonderful panel. So I will allow our panelists to give some opening remarks in response to that, and then we'll dive in straight to the discussion. Mr. King, it's your first time on a Globespan show, so I'll give you the opening honors. Thank you so much. Oh, you're on mute.
I thought everyone was reading my lips.
You're not George H.W. Bush. You don't want them to read your lips.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Paul King. For those of you who don't know me, I'm running for Congress in District 5, which has a very significant, Guyanese community. It's currently represented by Gregory Meeks, as it has been for the last 25 years. I look forward to digging deeper into the subject, but just an immediate response to a couple of thoughts you put out there, Rusat. Here, especially in America, I think people's attention spans are short because there's so much being thrown at us. So I think people were very concerned at first when they heard about Venezuela with this buildup, and they want to steal the resources from Guyana, and everyone said it's wrong. And then if it doesn't happen in a couple of weeks, people start worrying about other things, and they forget that it's going on and getting worse. And you mentioned Ukraine. It was a little bit like that when Russia was doing their buildup. At first, it was like, oh my goodness, they're going to invade. And then it was like, oh, well, they're probably not going to. They've waited this long. Why would they? And then next thing you know, we're in a war. So you have to be vigilant and look at all the possibilities. And we need active representation who are, your representatives in Congress don't make foreign policy, but they can influence and communicate to the powers that be what's important to us and what we need to do to assure peace and protect friends like the country of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. King. And Devin, if you could just put up some of those images again from the CSIS. I just want to make a quick point. So as Mr. King was saying, attention spans can be short. Everyone's attention was on this in December, but as we look here, this satellite imagery, May 12th is when this satellite image was taken. It was published May 28th. Right? This other one was taken March 26th and also published in the May report. So while others may have taken their eyes off it as the months go on, from December to February to March to April to May to June, Maduro hasn't taken his eyes off it. His eyes are still on it, right? And clearly you see that actions speak louder than words. He may be shaking hands and smiling when he has to meet at the peace talks, but his actions are speaking in what he's actually doing in the Ankoko Island military base buildup. And those images are very recent. The last time we had a discussion on this topic was, I believe, in February. And some people may say, oh, the topic has finished. Well, why keep talking about it? It's still happening. Maduro is still acting on it in May. So that's why a discussion is still warranted now at the beginning of June, because he has not stopped. And Mr. King, as you were introducing yourself, you mentioned you are the opponent of Gregory Meeks. Gregory Meeks, for our audience, is one of the main Democrats in foreign policy in the U.S. Congress, and that is why I invited Mr. King on, because we need to have a proper foreign policy debate. What is the role of the U.S. Congress in issues like this? That's why we see the U.S. Congress, for example, paying attention to Ukraine or Israel or other global conflicts. And I will, go further into that later. What has Gregory Meeks done or not done with relation to this particular topic? Mr. Lally, I'll give you the chance to make some opening remarks. Sorry about that.
Good evening, Rusat. It's great to be on, and thanks for inviting me back. A couple things on this. Let's start with Anacoco Island. I mean, if you wanted to launch a military invasion, it would be the stupidest place you could start a military invasion from, because it is at the very western end of Guyana. It is completely surrounded by jungle, and impenetrable jungle and rivers. You can't get to any other part of Guyana without crossing a significant body of water, a river, or a major estuary to get there. So militarily, it's not really a threat to Guyana, but I think what it represents is a political probing by Maduro and his Bolivarian regime to see what the political support is for Guyana, and to do it in a place that really doesn't matter, because it's deep jungle with no people, and no people even anywhere close to it. Frankly, if there were a war, the troops that Venezuela has in Anacoco Island would be sitting ducks. They would be the most vulnerable troops in the world to airstrikes if there were support from Brazil or America, or frankly, even the Guyanese military. So I don't see it as a threat, but what it is a continual probing by Maduro to see if the political support for Guyana is there, and to just rattle the cage. Remember, he has a essentially rigged presidential election coming up. So this is part of his saber rattling to try to whip up his supporters in advance of that presidential election. I don't think militarily it's a threat, but politically it's certainly an escalation. Let me go to one of the comments Mr. King mentioned. And by the way, congratulations on the nomination. My father-in-law, Jorawar Masir, who was born in 43 Village and quarantined in Berbice in Guyana, he was a former Republican nominee for that same congressional seat. Wow. This is actually when I first met him. I was running in the neighboring seat in the North Shore of Long Island. So good luck to you in the race.
Thank you.
One of the things you raised, though, which is the support that the U.S. Congress can, and the influence that the U.S. Congress can make, is extremely important. One of the things I worked on during the George W. Bush administration was the Irish peace process, which Rusat, you mentioned. And I actually wrote the platform of the Republican Party on that, and then spent a lot of time back and forth between New York and Dublin and Belfast on the Irish peace process. So having domestic support within the U.S., having members of Congress who are, after all, fairly close to real people, but having people being able to get members of Congress to advocate and to have that attention given is so important. So I think that was a really, really astute point that you raised, Mr. King.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Lally. And I'll go into Mr. Jonas for your opening remarks. And also, Mr. Jonas, in addition to the question, because since you are the only one on this panel who's currently in Guyana and an active political leader in Guyana, we were talking off air about the lack of local media attention in Guyana. Do you think that is a positive or a negative in this circumstance? Because look, if it was being covered all the time, you may just have people whipped up in a frenzy, right? But at the same time, if you are not covering it at all, then people are blissfully oblivious and unaware of what may be going on. So, Mr. Jonas, your opening remarks.
Yeah, it would be a serious crime of omission to be oblivious to this and to pretend it's not happening. So my first reaction, as you can imagine, when the topic came up, was to ask myself and to make some inquiries. If something is going on, if this pot is being stirred, why is it that there's no mention of it, or very little mention in our media? I think there was some third page note in the Kaitra News about it, but you know, not central. And it bothered me because it's such an important topic. It's so potentially devastating, and no mention. Now, Mr. King made the point, public attention is short. That's part of it, no doubt. I think another part of it was that possibly with the full realization that militarily there's absolutely nothing Guyana can do about it anyway, most of us grasped at the straw, and probably with some justification, by given the actions of America, their flyovers, the military presence in the Caribbean Sea and that kind of thing, that a clear statement was being made that we would have help. We were not on our own in this issue. And as you know, I had previously pointed out the geography of the location. Now, I'm no military expert, so I was going to express it with much more reserve than Mr. Lally just did. But he has been unequivocal and has you know, given some courage to my words that Ankoko Island is far away. It's surrounded by, he call it jungle, we call it bush, but impenetrable vegetation. And when I look at the picture that is put up here, I see an airstrip, I see a bridge, and I don't see much else. And it makes me ask the question, what developments exist as shown in this picture that did not exist a few months ago when this was front and center in everybody's attention? The actual infrastructure that we're looking at here is not much. And anybody who has had sight of Guyana from the air knows that what we're looking at there is jungle. All that's happened is a few small tracts have been carved out of the jungle, and an airfield has been carved out of the jungle. And on Ankoko Island, which Venezuela has been in possession of for decades. So I'm not seeing clear evidence from this photograph, if this is the photograph we're relying on evidentially. I'm not seeing clear evidence here that there has been any serious act of aggression further than what took place a few months ago. And I am very, very cautious, given the fact of our military position, against anything that can be done to raise the temperature, to raise fears. I'm conscious that when this first came up, things became very difficult in Essequibo. The economy really suffered as a result. People were terrified. They didn't know what the future held, and they recognized their own helplessness. So on the one hand, we need to be informed. We need to know what's going on. On the other hand, we need to be very careful not to raise fears and raise temperatures. And I think that sense of responsibility needs to be front and center. It needs to be what we're looking at.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. So in response to the question about, these are the images we're relying on. So there is a full, much longer report. These are the images that we could republish. So these were a few of them. There are more images in total. And in terms of what has been added on, the report does go into detail about, like, say, what is there now that is not there in January. And a lot of it tends to be, for example, the types of ships and the types of actually equipment that is currently there. So in terms of building more bridge, port, etc., that can have more military equipment be held there, and in terms of the amount of individuals that could be there as well. So the report does go into more detail about that, and I get it that some of the images that we show, you can't see all of that from the images, but I encourage those in the audience, to read the full report if they can. It's from the CSIS, and it's the report that has been published in May about the Essequibo. And in addition, we're talking about the location. They did address the fact that, okay, the location is not what stands out to you as the ideal military location if you're going to do some type of full-scale invasion, which is, so they address that and they say that, look, it doesn't look like the guy's going to do a full-scale invasion, but also, why is he doing all of this if there is nothing up his sleeves? So one possibility they suggested is that he's somehow trying to mirror what Putin was doing in Ukraine, in the sense that Putin did not just invade Ukraine in 2022. He was doing build-ups in different regions by the Russia-Ukraine border for years ahead of time, especially the Donbass region from 2014 to 22. And obviously it culminated in 2022 with that full-scale invasion. But could Maduro be trying to do smaller things on the side, see what he can get away with in the meantime? But then they also do reflect the fact that he does not have a full-scale timeline at his at his pleasure, because he does have that July election. Is he just trying to manufacture some crisis between now and July for that? But yeah, so that is what we're covering with regards to the CSIS report and update. Devin, if you want to put up a bit of what the Miami Herald was reporting on it, it goes in depth into what the analysis was. Do you have those? Yeah. So yeah, we're seeing through satellite. So this is the direct reporting. We're seeing through satellite imagery the increasingly rapid buildup of the military base at Ankelco, where they just constructed a bridge and brought a bunch of new tanks. So these are some of the things that they've done from a few months ago to now. They're deploying additional naval assets and aircraft in the city of Furia, Zulfikar missile boats. So that goes into detail about what exactly has changed from a few months ago to now. But understandably, you can't see all of that in just a few images. And they do address that, saber rattling, and it's Maduro ahead of the July presidential election. But, as it says here, it showed this week that Venezuela now has substantial quantities of personnel and equipment in sites near the disputed border, particularly the expanding military base at the border island. And obviously, yes, we don't want to, just fearmonger for the sake of it, but we also seek to try to have that balance of informing where otherwise the discussion is not taking place in certain venues. But Mr. King, to you, we were talking earlier about Gregory Meeks and his foreign policy status. He is one of the main House Democrats on foreign policy. Now, as you're saying, Meeks has been the congressperson for this particular area in Queens since 1998. Typically, he has had support from Guyanese in the Guyanese community. That's one of the reasons he's been in there for so long. So the particular area in Queens where Mr. King is running is the 5th congressional district. That, I believe, has probably the highest portion of Guyanese Americans of probably any congressional district in the United States. Mm-hmm. So Meeks has tried to cater to the Guyanese community in the past. For example, during the 2020 elections crisis in Guyana, he was one of the more active congressional representatives, and especially he was on the side of trying to actually get the free and fair election results counted, whereas other congressional Democrats, be it Yvette Clarke and Hakeem Jeffries, weren't necessarily on the right side of that issue. So Meeks has been good in his relationship with the Guyanese community overall on certain issues like the 2020 elections crisis. He has not been as active on the Guyana-Venezuela issue, and I've heard from community leaders, even Democrats, trying to reach out to him on that, and he was not as responsive as usual, not as responsive as they'd like him to be. Part of the reason could be that Meeks has a bit of a different relationship with Venezuela than most Democrats. He has historically had a closer relationship with the Venezuelans. For example, he was I believe the only U.S. congressman to go to the funeral of Hugo Chavez, and at one point he was even being suggested as to be some sort of a breaking point individual between the Biden administration and the Maduro administration to have a thaw in U.S.-Venezuelan relations. I believe we have a piece of that AP article on that. Devin, if you could pull that up. In the meantime, Devin's pulling that up. Yeah. So we got that there. New York Democrats ties to Maduro may help Biden unlock stalemate. So Gregory Meeks has been, a main point man on these types of issues. I'm wondering, Mr. King, what do you think of how he has handled the Guyana Venezuela crisis in the a few months ago, and how he's handling the Guyanese community at large right now?
Okay. Well, I will give him credit for doing the right thing when the PNC didn't want to give up power, and I think there are people who are grateful for that. Overall, though, I think in general, before I get into Venezuela, Gregory Meek's style isn't to be a leader on issues. When he goes with the path of power. So, he jumped on board Hillary Clinton vote on 2012 because he assumed she was going to be the president. And he rides with Biden to get himself more power. Nowadays, even though he's certainly senior in years to Jeffries, he defers to Jeffries a lot. And we know that Jeffries was on the wrong side of the issue, which doesn't mean he's necessarily going to flip and just mimic what Hakeem Jeffries does, but it does give me pause as to how steady a partner he's going to be for a friendly country like Guyana. When it comes to his relationship with Venezuela, I think you're spot on. He definitely has a chummy relationship there. I think I have an older picture of him and Maduro when they were both younger. So it's not bad to have a relationship with a foreign leader, even if someone as crazy as Maduro. It can be useful, but his message consistently has been to be kind of friendlier and go lighter on Venezuela. And a specific story just from a few months ago, maybe late last year. I've been a community leader in Rockaway for well over a decade, maybe 20 years. And in that entire time, Gregory Meeks has never called a meeting with civic leaders, at least nothing that involved my part of his district. I'm sure you experienced the same thing on the west side of the Van Wyck. He's not that engaged with civic leaders, but he was concerned about the migrant issue because it's obviously been a problem for Democrats. So, but as part of that meeting, the two things that came out very strongly in my mind were, one is he really emphasized, he felt like we need to reduce sanctions on Venezuela. And not that it was totally out of left field, but it was something he was pushing pretty strongly when we were there to talk about there's an illegal migrant camp being built in Floyd Field. It's directly against what was written by, when Congress created Gateway National Recreation Area. But he was focusing on, he wanted to lighten up on Venezuela, who's not exactly a good actor. And the other thing that came out clear was he desperately would like the Democrats to take over the House because he's currently the ranking member, the top Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He wants the chair back so he can call the shots and decide where they're going to travel. And it's nice to say, hey, my congressman's this powerful guy, but if he's putting his weight and he's friendly with the wrong side, it's not good for our community. It's certainly not good for American foreign policy.
Yes. To follow up on that, so you're talking about so Meeks had been one of those Democrats who wanted to loosen sanctions on Venezuela. So the U.S. has not had a good relationship with Venezuela for years, dating back, say, to the Bush era when Hugo Chavez was in power, and even more sanctions have been done in recent years, especially the Trump administration. Some Democrats under the Biden administration have advocated for loosening sanctions. Meeks has been one of those Democrats. So at the same time that Venezuela has been saber rattling, to say the least, with Guyana, and military buildup, to say the worst, there are some congressional Democrats like Gregory Meeks who have been advocating for sanctions relief because they're prioritizing other issues. They're turning a blind eye to the Guyana-Venezuela crisis. They're saying, okay, because of oil prices globally right now, or the U.S. Not being able to get or the West not being able to get as much oil from Russia or the Middle East due to current global conflicts. Let's open up the Venezuelan oil market, which has been sanctioned off. If you were elected to Congress and you were the congressperson for the area and not Gregory Meeks, what would your position on sanctions with Venezuela be?
Well, I think, and maybe I'm old-fashioned and maybe a little too idealistic, but if you're, I look at the world as a neighborhood, and when there's bad actors in your neighborhood, whether it's on your street or a few blocks over, and you say this is someone we can't deal with, or you don't turn around and say, well, he's not being good to, I feel like he's a danger to our children, but there could be some financial advantage if I go back and be friends with him again. That's the kind of immoral trade-off that you really should never make. or maybe there's never, almost never make in the world, and then you give up your moral authority when you say, okay, I think part of what's going on here, we want to get the gas prices down ahead of the election in 2024. So let's shake hands with someone who's doing bad things and we have not trusted to be a good actor for a long time. I think if you take the position we want to change someone else's behavior, we can help them change behavior, but we can't reward them, for other reasons, again, financial or out of weakness, because that just emboldens bullies to push even harder.
Yeah. No, so I wanted to focus on the sanctions there with the fault because, as Mr. Lally was talking about as well, the power of the U.S. Congress, especially in terms of foreign policy. What can the U.S. Congress do? What can members of Congress vote on? Sanctions is one of the main things. I believe today the House is even having a vote on sanctioning the ICC, which that's a whole nother discussion, but just goes to show the power of the Congress in foreign relations. Sanctions is one of the main powers. I saw Mr. Jonas smirk on that one because the U.S. sanctioning the ICC is not a good look for the U.S. around the world, but that is the current debate going on in Washington right now. So we're talking about earlier the power Guyanese Americans could have as a voting bloc. I mentioned that the seat Mr. King is running for, the 5th Congressional District, which is most of South Queens. You can go into depth about what the boundaries are, but that is where one of the highest concentration of Guyanese American the Guyanese American population is in this country. So if Guyanese Americans were as a voting bloc to have an influence on elections, it would be in areas like this, right? The 5th Congressional District, or in areas like Long Island, where they're increasingly moving out to. They're leaving Queens, going out to Long Island too, where Mr. Lally once ran. Mr. Lally was the congressional nominee in the 3rd Congressional District. So, Mr. Lally, over your long years of experience in politics, I wonder, how have you seen the Guyanese American population in New York as a voting bloc trying to get their views across on issues like foreign policy? Have you seen it progress? What would you like to see it progress more in future? And what areas do you think they can focus on? Like if they target certain congressional areas, that how can they leverage their influence the best? You can speak about your congressional area that you once were the nominee for, and others in that area in New York, like the one Mr. King is running for now, and your father-in-law was once the nominee for.
Yes. Look, the challenge the Guyanese community faces is there are just not that many Guyanese in America. I'm part Irish American. There are 45 million Irish Americans. Maybe there are 600,000 Guyanese. So it's a scale difference. America's a huge country, but politics is very personal. So people can reach out to members of Congress whom they know. Look, I did it in 2020 in the wake of the election, called members of Congress whom I knew, and I said, "Hey, you've got to get on board and stop this fraud in Guyana and support the declaration of the real election results." And a lot of them did, both Republicans and Democrats. So it does make a difference. But as a massive voting bloc, Guyanese are spread out all over the place. Most in Queens and Long Island, but go up to Schenectady, there's a Guyanese community. Go down to Florida and Orlando, there's a pretty decent Guyanese community. So, we're everywhere. But also, it's not as important right now if we're talking about Venezuela, because in the wake of the 2020 elections, everything was raw, everything was open. America hadn't devised a clear policy for years prior to that because they didn't know what was going to happen in March of 2020, in April, and May, and June, and July. But we know with Venezuela, and America has a very clearly defined foreign policy that says Venezuela will not invade Guyana, period. Brazil, massive country, has a very clearly defined foreign policy towards Venezuela. Venezuela will not invade Guyana, period. Colombia, a huge country, powerful country, on the other side of Venezuela, has a clear foreign policy that Venezuela will not invade Guyana. The British and the French are in French Guyana, have a very clear policy, which is that Venezuela will not invade Guyana. So we're already way beyond the level of having congressmen call up and push and prod. The policy's already been formed. We can back it up. We can support the policy, but the policy's already there. And the truth is, Maduro stopped after his political testing because he got a far stronger reaction back from CARICOM and from all the neighboring countries and from the United States and Canada and Britain and France and India, which said, nope, you are not going to invade Guyana. So, I think we already have the policy, and we need to support it, and we need to make sure that people know that it's supported, but it's already there, and it's already really had the deterrence effect. And let me also say, I give the government of Guyana, President Irfan Ali, Vice President Barrett Jagdeo, that whole team a lot of credit, because they handled the crisis when Venezuela first rattled the cage and rattled their saber. They handled the crisis with incredible diplomatic maturity and restraint and sophistication, and helped to line up all of that support, that critical support, and that strong support. I mean, I was down at the Pegasus Hotel. I had to vacate our suite because the commanding admiral of the American fleet was flying in to take over that suite. We couldn't extend. So there was a lot of strong American military involvement and support for Guyana. And that's true of a lot of the other countries in the area. So, I think things are pretty good right now in that way.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. So, I mean, there's some things that I agree with you a lot on. Some things that I want to question a bit more. Obviously, I agree that I think that the government, President Ali, Vice President Jagdeo, handled it, fairly well in December. I think that the U.S. response and the British response, and that it created a strong deterrent. And obviously, the worst is past in that regard. Now, a few things that I would say. I think that, to go with the other point. I agree with you. The Guyanese American population is very small, right, compared to other immigrant populations in the U.S. However, it does have a benefit of being, say, relatively concentrated in certain areas, like New York City. It's one of the largest immigrant population groups in New York City, and I'm of the belief that if given that size in that particular area, especially say Queens and Long Island, as you were mentioning earlier, if they had or if they do apply themselves in a more united way, they can impact those areas. And I'm not saying that we're like the Irish population where it can impact, say, the whole nation. As you're saying, Irish Americans, over 40 million, right? And that's why you've had so many Irish American presidents. But say congressional races in these areas, Queens, New York, Long Island, New York, in those areas, that's where you can have an impact, and where foreign policy matters can come up in those elections. Like in your area, the 3rd Congressional District, I don't need to tell you that it's one of the largest percentage of, say, Jewish American voters in a congressional district in the country. I think it's one at the top. And that's why even before the latest October 7th incident, even beforehand, continuously in congressional races in those areas, Israel has always been a major issue because of that. And that goes to the other point that, look, the Venezuela crisis may not be at its peak now. It may have withered away, and Maduro may be a madman, and nobody can predict what this guy's going to do. But at the same time, it's better to be prepared before something hits rather than after. Like I want to choose my words carefully here, but I'd say the supporters of the Israeli-American relationship didn't start their lobbying efforts just after October 7th, because they've had organizations in place in there for years who've had entrenched, established relationships. When crisis hits Israel, they can take advantage of that long established relationship and say, look, we have this established relationship, alliance, etc. Now that Israel is harmed, the U.S. as its ally will do X, Y, Z. And I guess what I'm trying to advocate for is for Guyana and Guyanese Americans to take example from that and say, we're Jewish American supporters of Israel or Irish Americans supporters of the peace process have successfully set that model in place for Guyanese Americans to try to do that in their own way where they can impact U.S. politics in areas like Queens and Long Island, so that, God forbid, crisis ever hits Guyana in that regard. But if and when that day did come, they have that network in place to take it upon themselves rather than having to start that network the day after a crisis hits, or using the semblance of a network we may have now, but not as well established yet. If that point may come across, Mr. Lally, I'll give you the chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize this, but no, I think that's exactly right. And look, a lot of it is just being ready and having people who are used to working with each other and are coordinated and can reach out to organizations. Look, when it comes to Venezuela, even though there were divisions within or between parts of the Guyanese community in 2020 after the elections, I don't think there's any divisions when it comes to a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. I think everybody's united. Hakeem Jeffries has a substantial Guyanese community in his district. Gregory Meeks has a substantial Guyanese community in his district. There are substantial communities out here on Long Island. I mean, I was just at the Guyanese flag raising for the celebration of the anniversary of Independence Day. And Don Clavin, who's the supervisor of the town of Hempstead, commented, number one, the town of Hempstead has 800,000 people, so it's actually bigger than Guyana. But he said they did a count, and there are 2,000 or 3,000 Guyanese voters in Hempstead, and in close elections that makes a huge difference. So it always makes a difference, and we had a great turnout that day as well. So all good.
Thank you, Mr. Lally. It's 8:15. I know Devin asked me to take Mr. Singh asked me to take a 8:15 break. So we'll take the 8:15 break, and then I have a exciting question for Mr. Jonas right after that.
It's an all-inclusive vacation with your cuisine, your culture, and your music in Jamaica. You get a choice of 6 restaurants, 11 bars, 3 pools, beach days, day tours, plus much more. Meet and greet with your fellow West Indians from the US, Canada, Trinidad, Guyana, and other places. Curry Duck versus Duck Curry Competition Day. Private entertainment night with the showstopper Raymond Ramnarine, Vijay Ramkisoon, Sheila, Ariana, DJ Turbulence, Tassa from the Extraordinaires Tassa Group, and much, much more. Beach Day with Harmonium and Dholan. 5 days in Jamaica. Your music, your culture, your entertainment. Flights from New York, Florida, Canada, Trinidad, and Guyana. Departing dates August 15th or 16th. Return dates August 19th or the 20th.
Call Travelspan in Georgetown at 227-1701, or in Berbice at 337-4287, or in New York at 212-243-0865.
See you in Jamaica.
This is the dance, let's go. Follow me now.
Travelspan is offering an all-inclusive vacation to Jamaica with entertainment by Ronnie McIntosh, Crazy, and DJ Maddie. Get 6 restaurants, 3 pools, 11 bars, day tours, and beach days. Meet and greet West Indians from US, Canada, Trinidad, and Guyana. 5 days in Jamaica, all-inclusive hotel, transfers, airfare, and entertainment with Ronnie McIntosh and Crazy in Jamaica. Flights depart on August 8th or 9th for 5 days. It's all-inclusive with your culture, your music, and your entertainment. Call Travelspan in Georgetown at 227-1701, or in Berbice at 337-4287, or in New York at 212-243-0865.
Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country. country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
In the sky, let the whole world see, let the whole world see, let the whole world see. Green, red, yellow, black and white's the place to be, the place to be.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity. We're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Thank you for joining us back for our Globespan discussion tonight. Once again, Reset Ramfeld, joined by Mr. Grant Lally, Mr. Paul King, and Mr. Timothy Jonas. So we just ended off a lively discussion about Venezuela and U.S. politics and the U.S.-Guyana relationship. We'll continue talking about U.S. politics and the U.S.-Guyana relationship with our former congressional nominee, current congressional nominee. But we have a third-party leader in Guyana, in Mr. Timothy Jonas, and I had an exciting question for him based on some global events that happened recently. So whenever we have Mr. Jonas on, I ask him about what his vision is for a third party in Guyana. And when I saw some of the global news recently, he was the first person I thought of. So in South Africa, the African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, which was thought to be invincible within the modern South African democratic political system, they lost their majority for the first time in the 30 years of democracy in South Africa since 1994 to now. It's the first time the ANC has ever lost their majority. So, enough South Africans were disaffected with them that they didn't reward them with the majority. They are still the largest party. They may still likely form the government, but they have been, punished in a way by some of their long-standing voters. In India, Narendra Modi was thought to be, invincible going into this election. Some compared him to God. He compared himself to God. But when the election results came, he was denied a majority. In terms of his party, the BJP, they did not directly achieve a majority. He will have a coalition that will get enough seats to be a majority. But again, the BJP, which was aiming for 400 seats in India, it didn't even get 250 by itself. It got to 240 in the end. And these thought to be invincible parties, the BJP in India, ANC in South Africa, came up relatively short of their goals on the election day, denied a majority by their voters, and will have to actually enter coalition building talks. And that's how the democratic process will work in those countries, which at times the democratic process may be hurt in those countries when you have one party that just has a majority and can do anything they want. And that is what Mr. Jonas has criticized in Guyana for years. And that's what he's talked about, in terms of having a third party, the hope that they could be a kingmaker and in terms of coalitions one day. I think he will describe that better than me when I give him his chance to respond. But yeah, look, you have two historic parties in Guyana, the PNC and the PPP. Obviously, both will always try to get an outright majority, but you may end up, having the case one day where, look, obviously you had that period in 2011, which, that's another discussion, but where they are denied majorities, and then that's interesting for the democratic process, whether they then have to rely on other smaller parties for support, as is happening now in South Africa and India. So, Mr. Jonas, I'll give you the chance to talk about that. What you saw in South Africa and India, is that the ideal situation, say, for Anog in Guyana? Is that what you want to see happen one day? I know that the systems, yes, they do have their slight differences in terms of how coalitions are built, but is that what you'd want to see one day? The major party that's thought to be invincible going into the election, denied the outright majority. They will still be the largest party, but they need that smaller third party to be a coalition here or there, and that's how you can actually make a democracy stronger in the end.
I like your comparisons. I like the India-South Africa comparisons. And I like that you focused on coalitions and the need. I think South Africa got 14 days and India got a period of time. to arrange coalitions and settle on a coalition before going into government. Now, democracy can never be one size fits all, and you really got to structure your system to the peculiarities of your own society. A lot of people respond to me to say that many democracies got two large parties. What's wrong with Guyana's two large parties? And there's no doubt about that. You got Democrats and Republicans, and you got conservatives and liberals. So the two that immediately come to mind are perfect examples of that, two large parties. And any third independent has a very small chance. The thing with us and our peculiarity is race. The two parties are not separated or identifiable by differences in economic policies or social policies. One is not liberal, one is not conservative, one is not capitalist, one is not socialist. One is Afro and one is Indo. It's as easy as that. And for that reason, whatever the spiel might be at election time, whatever the speeches might be, the votes do not turn on economic or social policies. The votes turn on the perception that the party that doesn't look like you is likely to have policies, whether deliberately or accidentally, which will keep you out of benefiting from most of the institutions that you should have access to. So there is that perception. And it was a revelation to me. It took me a little while to formulate this and to reach to this realization, almost an epiphany, that Guyanese don't vote race. Guyanese vote against race. Guyanese vote against the party that they see as an institution which intrinsically will exclude them from the benefits of society. So they vote against the party that doesn't look like them. And 90% of Guyanese do it. And they don't do it because they like the party that looks like them. They do it because they correctly recognize that the party that doesn't look like them is likely to have policies which exclude them. It's the truth. So the problem with that and our own peculiarity then is that whereas in India, where everybody looks the same, I'm ignoring caste differences. That's not really relevant in Indian politics when we're talking about the larger picture of coalitions. You can conceivably, after an election, have two parties engaging in a conversation toward a coalition because their policies align in some areas, might not align in other areas. In Guyana, if a Guyanese is persuaded to vote against the ethnic trend, he's voting against that party because that party is next to the devil. That party is unacceptable. And therefore, if my party, if an independent party, ANAG, were to go to any of the large parties to pretend towards some kind of alignment, some kind of coalition, we would be betraying those people who had sufficient independence of thought to reject the race politics, to say, I'm moving away from that and voting for an independent, but I still could never vote for those horrible, terrible people over there that are racist against me. We would be betraying them by going to have a talk with either of the two large parties. And therefore, I oppose any suggestion of post-election coalitions in Guyana. I'll give you a specific example, and I'll ask you to think of family members, because you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
If Rusat were to come and say, I like what you're doing, I'm voting ANAG, and then after the elections, me, Tim Jonas, were to go to have a conversation with Aubrey Norton to form a coalition, that would be a betrayal.
Yeah,
it would be unacceptable. So the post-election coalition is not going to work given the peculiarities of Guyana, and therefore the only option must be Plan B, which is the minority government, which does not control parliament, and unfortunately then will have to be faced with a hostile parliament, but fortunately a parliament that is truly independent in the context of the Westminster system. And I think that could be the only starting point for us Otherwise, we have the elected dictatorships that we're accustomed to, that don't just run government, but make the rules because they control parliament to perpetuate and consolidate their grasp of power.
I understand the point fully, and I'm not saying anything personally how I would be in a situation like that, but I know how people may be in Guyana in a situation like that. But two faults.
I'm sure you understood the example.
Yeah, no, I know. I understood. I understood the example fully.
Yeah.
But two faults on that that I found very interesting about what you're saying. So we're talking about the idea of being betrayed by some sort of post-election coalition building, especially in Guyana because of ethnic divides. But that can also take place without ethnic divides, right? So the example I'm thinking of is, okay, say the mother of the parliamentary system in the UK, right? In the UK system, the last time that there was some sort of post-election coalition government that was formed was in 2010. David Cameron got a conservative minority government coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats. So Cameron won by I think it was 310 seats. The Liberal Democrats won like 56 seats. Come the next general election in 2015, Clegg's is totally wiped out. They go from 56 seats to like 5 seats, and the reason for that they lose 90% of the seats that they have is Clegg's Liberal Democrat voters say to him, "Look, we never voted for you to go into coalition with the Conservatives in the first place. We voted," and this is not based on race. This is based on just simple political ideology. Clegg's voters say, "Look, we were voting third party for a reason. We didn't vote for you just to become some type of member of a conservative coalition government and just go along with the Conservatives." So isn't that just a risk in general that you face as a third party? The idea that your voters who think that, yes, intellectually we abandoned the two major parties in the first place to go for you as a third party, and could they not feel betrayed anyway? Like, even if you took race out of it, it's just a hypothetical, and it just became an ideological thing, or purely on the parties, that they felt, oh, you betrayed us, you went to coalition, we're not voting for you again. We abandoned the two major parties for a reason. We went with you as a third party coalition. Is that what we wanted anyways?
You make a good point, and you do run a risk. The example you gave, going with the liberals, the ultra liberals, good example. But the fact is that a voter in England or the States that's voting along policies, along economic policies, he can change his mind, she can change her mind, so that a voter can vote Republican this time and vote Democrat next time, vote Conservative this time and Liberal next time, because of the successes of the party, or because of the failures of the party, or because they themselves have had an evolution. I'm afraid I can't evolve racially. I am who I am. And the PNC and the PPP have never evolved racially. They are who they are. So come hell or high water, the devil or gentle Jesus, we will vote how we vote. And therefore that betrayal is intractable. That position of how we're voting will never move. So you take a chance in England, but you commit suicide in Guyana if you try to join one of the parties. And if you don't believe me, ask AFC.
No, I get your point. I think the AFC's problems are a bit well, that's another discussion. But in terms of in terms of what you said, that you can't change your race, as a joking matter, nowadays you can change things that nobody thought you could change 20 years ago. So God knows where we'll be one day in society. And I think some people will get the joke I'm making there. But you made a interesting point about people can switch votes in terms of their parties more easily in the US or UK just based on ideology. One of the reasons I found that the South Africa and India example so interesting, and that's why I wanted to ask you about it, is so normally when we talk about say US and Guyana comparison, you say, look, the US doesn't have the same racial voter dynamic that Guyana has, and that's obvious to anyone. But South Africa and India do have a racial and religious element to their politics that is, highly prevalent. The one of the reasons the ANC has kept on to power for 30 years is not because they actually do for the people. They just hold on to this thing. Look, we were that party that rescued you from apartheid, and therefore Black South Africans should vote for us continuously. And enough Black South Africans abandoned them to deny them a majority at this point, which was something that was not thought possible just a short time ago. It was once thought in South Africa that they will always vote race and the ANC will always stay in power, unconditionally for as long as they want, because there's enough black South Africans that will vote race, vote for the ANC, keep them in power. In India, Narendra Modi was trying to rely on the fact that India is a majority Hindu country. He did an unprecedented level of trying to tie Hinduism to voting for the BJP. He literally inaugurated that the Ram Temple in Ayodhya as part of his election messaging. He did a lot of controversial things in terms of trying to turn Hindus against Muslims in his campaign and his time as leader. But enough Indian Hindus who clearly voted for him previously, because he was elected with resounding majorities twice, enough of them abandoned him and did not vote simply based on ethnic or religious lines again, and denied him majority this time. So the fact that enough South Africans or enough Indians could abandon that sense of mentality that has been so prevalent across post-colonial third world democracies of voting on ethnic or racial lines rather than ideological lines, does that give you increased hope or sense that can happen one day in Guyana, that enough people, look, obviously change is not going to happen overnight, but that enough people will slowly wake up and start voting not just simply on those lines? If it could happen in India, South Africa, it can happen in Guyana.
I'm not sure, and I agree with your interpretation of how it evolved. ANC is Nelson Mandela's party, and the ANC was the response to apartheid, and response to white rule. But after a generation, when apartheid is now a distant memory there, you will notice that the party that made inroads into the ANC was another black party.
There's a point.
So what's happened is that the white minority in South Africa is such a small voting bloc from any real perspective that they're not a threat politically. And therefore, the majority South African population can come to the recognition of apartheid being a distant memory, Nelson Mandela being long since dead, and his policies having been eroded by various aspects of corruption and self-indulgence. They can come to the conclusion logically and clearly and without fear of anybody that doesn't look like them, that this party has not been doing very much for me. And I can vote for another party because there are enough of me, and the other party I'm voting for looks like me anyway. That's not the case in Guyana, and that's why I say we can't have one size fits all, because the demography in Guyana is on it's so close. You don't know who has 50% in Guyana right now and who has 51%. You don't know. And because that racial demography is so closely balanced, the other side is a threat because they can win. The other side in South Africa can't win. The Muslims in India can't win.
So a few points. The South Africa example is interesting without boring the audience and going too into it. So there is the minor party, African party, that increased their vote share and that helped deny the majority. But also at the same time, the opposition party, the DA, which is a majority white party, was able to increase their vote share as well. And that those two forces coming from different angles did help deny the majority to the ANC. But so the white party majority, the DA, was able to increase their vote share, particularly not just among whites, but also Indians and particularly the under 35 group in South Africa, which, to your point, there are enough South Africans now who were not born under apartheid who can vote differently. Do you think that one day that will be the case in Guyana, where enough younger voters will not be talking about memories of 1964 and the Burnham years and this and that, and that one day they will be voting with less, let's just say, I want to be careful with the wording here, but that they will not be voting based on historical grievances on either side. But
I don't think our historical grievances go back that far. I think they go back to 85.
The reason I use 64 as my example is I grew up in a household where that was the pivotal year, and I think a lot of Guyanese would remember that.
But half of Guyana will tell you that they were rigged elections until 85 and 92 were the first free elections. And curious that you mention it, because memories began to soften in 2011 and soften further in 2015. And then everyone was very firmly reminded in 2020.
Yeah.
So APNU has shot itself in the foot in that regard. People again have drawn lines in the sand, which will take time again to soften.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you that people are more informed, better educated. They see how small Guyana is in the world and what the possibilities are in terms of where we can be. And on a day-to-day basis in our society, relations are very, very good. There's no distinction. I'll eat at your table, you'll eat at mine. I'll go to your mosque and you'll come to my church. There's no issues on a day-to-day basis. And I think for that reason, we will improve much more quickly than we did after 92.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. That in Guyana, unfortunately, you have those who remember 64, those remember say 85, 92, and then you have another generation now that remembers 2020, and then that may unfortunately lead to certain memories. But look, obviously you can be optimistic and say hopefully a younger, better informed generation will lead to change in the future. I'm sorry that the tangent with Mr. Jonas was so interesting. I kept going on, but Mr. King and Mr. Lally, I hope you appreciated that segment there. Now, continuing the broader based topic we were discussing earlier, I'll just ask you some general questions that we'll do all of you, and then we'll shortly start to wrap up. Mr. King in particular, we were talking earlier, I believe it was either you or Mr. Lally spoke about Hakeem Jeffries. I think you were speaking about him more. Now, in terms of what is at stake in the U.S. congressional elections this year, Hakeem Jeffries is currently the House Democratic leader. If the Democrats were to win the majority in the House this year, he would be the next Speaker of the House, which is one of the most important roles in the U.S. constitutional system in terms of being aligned with the presidency and the office and the powers it holds. What do you think a Speaker Jeffries would mean for the Guyanese community, the U.S.-Guyana relationship, and your larger thoughts on how the upcoming elections could affect that U.S.-Guyana relationship, for better and for worse?
Who's this question to?
Yeah, Mr. King.
Okay. Well, I actually would like to hear more from the other panelists about specifically how they think Hakeem Jeffries would affect the relationship between our two countries. My concern as a New Yorker, I grew up here in most of my life in Queens. I actually started in Brooklyn, but for the last 52 years I've lived here in Queens, and we like to talk about this being the most diverse place in the world. Though it's not so much the melting pot a lot of times. It's diverse on a grand scale numerically, but we're all in pockets. And we should be working together based on our common values. But, maybe, from a political perspective, it's not as sharp a contrast as Tim was talking about in Guyana, but we have all these divisions where we're being played off each other. And I think Hakeem Jeffries represents someone who consistently, if you look at the things he posts, things he writes about, the comments he makes over a long period of time, even though he's a talented congressman, he's always being divisive, and he's, got a different perspective about his people, and he's, one of the people who look like him. And in our district, we have people who look a lot of different ways. You have to represent all of us. And I hear this even at Memorial Day. I heard this from Gregory Meeks, and I heard it from other elected officials. They talk about how great it is, how important it is to have people who look like them. So they're talking to one segment of this diverse population. And I don't mind people being proud to be represented by people who have similar ethnic background. I'm sure my grandfather was proud when Fiorello LaGuardia was mayor of New York City. But we can't make all our decisions in a diverse country like ours, a diverse county like ours, putting those people first. And I think we see, and you certainly see in living in the community, how the disparity between the support that people on the east side of the Van Wyck get compared to the west side of the Van Wyck, where you live, and people look a little different, where the Guyanese community is in great number. It's the concentration there is substantial, that even if politicians weren't just doing the right thing by treating all citizens well, they would say, hey, wow, this is a significant voter block or should be a significant voter bloc. This is a significant part of my constituency. And bringing it back to Mr. Jeffries, I'm concerned he's so focused on racial polarization. He's got that too much in his DNA that it's not going to be good for those relations here in the country, and how that spills over to the international relations. I'll leave that up to Mr. Lally and Mr. Jonas.
Thank you, Mr. Lally. The same topic to you. And further, I remember the last time we were talking, we were saying about, you were talking about having been an election observer in 2020 in Guyana. We were talking about the 2020 elections process. And I remember I asked you the question about, Secretary Pompeo, providing that example, and doing the right thing in the 2020 elections. If you thought that any changes that have happened in the U.S. since then, with our own troubles, may affect how we are viewed across the world. So, in addition to the question about how November election upcoming, possibility Speaker Jeffries may affect the U.S.-Guyana relationship, I'm wondering, have any changes since the last time we've spoken affect how you think a future situation could go when the U.S. is trying to do the right thing and protecting democracy across the world? Specifically, since the last time we spoke, you've had the first conviction in New York of a former president, and especially when the U.S. is trying to, convince other countries across the world of, democratic reforms. One of the main things is in a transition, preventing any what may be seen as political prosecutions or politically motivated prosecutions. Is that something that now you think may be looked up with some form of skepticism the next time that the U.S. may tell a country like Guyana or any other country that?
Well, that certainly was a narrow question, Rusat. I want to thank you for keeping it on one focus. But let me go back, and I actually just wanted to address something that Tim had said regarding the future of Guyana and democracy in Guyana, and that's and let me relate it back. You Rusat, alluded to the coalition government that Nick Clegg formed with Cameron, between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. But that's increasingly the norm in the world. The French had a term for it; they called it cohabitation. And that's, American presidents have to deal with it all the time. Joe Biden has to deal with Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I mean, two different parties, very different political agendas. And there are often times, because both parties have their lunatic fringes at this point, where you actually find crossovers from one party supporting the leadership of the other and vice versa, just to maintain the stability of the institutions. If you look at South Africa, I mean, there will be a coalition government. And what's interesting is, I mean, Rusat, you talked about it being a majority white party, the DA. It's actually not a majority white party. Most of its votes come from the mixed race community and from the professional communities, the Black professional communities. One of the main opposition groups is 100% ethnic, which is the Zuma party, which is based in the Zulu region, because he's a Zulu, and so it's heavily ethnic. Just because someone from outside doesn't necessarily perceive the differences doesn't mean people who live there don't perceive differences and different alliances and different interests. So democracy is wonderfully complex, and every place has its cross-cutting complexities. So I'm actually extremely optimistic about Guyana, in no small part because God has smiled on the country, and God has delivered oil and money, which is translating into roadways and healthcare and education and computer access and all of the stuff that wealth brings. I mean, who knows? I mean, the next generation of kids could be on the internet and become complete, mental zombies like so many American kids are. But at the moment, it's actually delivering real and positive things for the Guyanese population. So I'm hoping if there's a hung parliament in the future, that in Guyana that we will see people forming coalitions, and we will see cohabitation, like you saw in France or England, or will be happening in so many other countries. So, but I'm optimistic. I think the enterprise of Guyana is now too important and too successful for it not to have the best of intentions given to it.
Thank you, Mr. Lally. Any thoughts on the question to Mr. King about in the November election, what it could mean for U.S.-Guyana relationship, possibility of Speaker Jeffries, or the other topic that was the recent trial, and whether you think that.
Look, I could talk at length about the Trump trial. One of the things I've done in the past has been an election attorney, and of all the charges and all of the things brought against Trump, this was vastly the worst, and frankly, this one should have been dismissed legally. Not that I could start wading into the legalisms, so let me wait a little bit.
Without getting into all legalisms, do you think specifically it would affect the perception of the U.S. when it tries to do that leader of the free world role in future in helping the democratic processes in other countries, as it did in Guyana in the past, and may one day have to again in the future?
America is is in its own crisis at the moment, and America is working itself through this crisis. And you have candidates for president who, wouldn't have been the choice of the majority of the American public, but the party systems have been dominated respectively by the two nominees who now have their nominations. So it's the choice we have, and the process is not as reflective. It's not as respectful as the process used to be, and this happened very quickly. But let's pray for the Republic and hope it gets through all of this.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lally. Mr. Jonas, any comment on those topics discussions now, Mr. King and Mr. Lally?
The ancient Greeks said democracy means leadership by the worst among us. And something in a man for all seasons, something comes to mind that if you sacrifice your personal integrity and do the wrong thing for what you see to be the good of the state, chaos results. I don't like the expression hung parliament. I know it's common. But I think that an opposition-controlled parliament in the context of Guyana is not necessarily a bad thing. I think given that the alternative is a government-controlled parliament, we've seen where that's got us. What we need, given that we have seen incompetence and inefficiencies in both parties, and quite frankly, a deteriorating level of competence in both parties over the last 60 years. And we recognize that it's very unlikely that any third party will win the attention of the people in any meaningful way. But we got to make use of the fact that the two parties essentially cancel each other out and hope that the small minority can have that swing in parliament, and hopefully can be peopled by people who have the competence to make better decisions than have been made. No other option really exists given our peculiarities. It's what we have, and it's the only game plan on the table right now.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Jonas. So we have a few minutes left until we close at 9, and I will let everyone get in their closing statements. I'll start off with Mr. King. I'll let you give your closing statement, and also any update you want to give on your campaign, any information that you want the viewers to know about your election that is coming up in November. I'll give you the chance to do that, as well as your closing statement on the topics discussed tonight.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate. I've actually learned a lot, which is which is always great. Still learning at my age. It's the only way we can solve problems together is to learn from each other. I think it is, as you said early on, wise to keep an eye on Maduro. Maybe nothing will happen, but once you stop paying attention, then bad things happen. And I think that it is important for the Guyanese American community to have their voices heard, both about the international issues and about what happens in our community. So, I talk a lot, gets off the international aspect of this. I talk about the American dream. People come here like, my grandparents and, a couple of generations before, other grandparents, to get an opportunity to build a better life. And that's what so many Guyanese Americans are doing. But, they're not getting the support they need, especially the business folks, children in school. So these are things I know how to fix. And that's why part of the reason I'm running. So if people want to learn more about me, I've got a website it's at king2024.us. That's the end of the commercial for me. But the Guyanese community is growing an important part of Queens, of Congressional District 5, and I'd be proud to represent them in Congress.
And if you could just describe again the area that is Congressional District 5, because as I was saying, I think it is the largest amount of Guyanese Americans in any congressional district. So a lot of the people viewing tonight may live in your district, and see your name on the ballot in the November election. So if you could just describe the rough boundaries of the area.
Absolutely. It on the north side, it runs kind of along Union Turnpike. So it's basically the southern half of Queens. So it runs from the Nassau County line, not all the way to Brooklyn, but to roughly Woodhaven Boulevard, Cross Bay Boulevard, and then from Union Turnpike all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean and Rockaway, where I live. And there are at least 80,000 Guyanese American citizens here, and a good majority of them, I think the majority of just in Queens, are in my district in that area, in South Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, etc.
Yeah, no, the New York Times said it's over 100,000 in that Richmond Hill area. So if you live in that Queens area, or your family lives in that Queens area, now you know who Mr. Paul King is. So thank you again, Mr. King, for coming on tonight and your appearance. Mr. Lally, your closing arguments or closing remarks for tonight's discussion. Sorry, it wasn't that much of an argument tonight, so it was very good.
Well, let me just say, Ruth, thank you for doing the show. Thank you for having such learned and thoughtful colleagues here on with me. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for what you're doing for the Guyanese community, because it does, having this show going and bringing attention to what was a little country and is now becoming a more and more important part of the world, is actually a great service. So thank you, and I'm looking to go back down to Guyana in a month or two, and we have to build a house, rebuild a house in 64 Village, and hopefully enjoy the beach. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lally, and thank you for all that you and your family do for the Guyanese community as well. We really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Mr. Jonas, your closing remarks.
I enjoyed this conversation, Rusat. I want to thank Mr. Lally for his very clear point of view on the Venezuela issue. It gives me some reassurance. He was preaching to the choir, but the choir likes to be preached to sometimes. So it gives me some level of comfort to hear another person expressing the same point of view, especially concerning the Brazilians, the Americans, and the English. I want to acknowledge Mr. King's courage in his discussion on the congressman and what he's facing in his own area. I agree with him, and I like his approach, and I wish him every success. Thanks, your son.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jonas. See, tonight was a very great intellectual discussion. So normally you say closing arguments. There were no arguments tonight. It was just a great discussion. I hope the audience enjoyed it. Wrapping up on the Venezuela point, look, reasonable people can can see different things on this, and especially I encourage people to read the CSIS report. They talk about all the different likely outcomes because it's hard to predict Maduro. It's unlikely that there'll be a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. It would be stupid to do it. The U.S., the U.K., anybody would immediately, or the major powers would immediately respond to it, and Guyana would have allies in that. But God knows what a madman like Maduro will do as he faces pressure and faces the upcoming July election. And as the report says, he may be trying to manufacture a crisis because it does not make sense what he is doing. And clearly he is doing something. That there is ongoing activity. And the most important thing, as the report says, is just to keep an eye on it and remain vigilant and not take the eye off of it. And that's what we intended to do with this program tonight. Just keep the viewers informed, keep an eye on it. It's not trying to, fear monger or tell you to look at it one way or the other. Just keep yourself informed on the issues. That's what we try to do here at Globespan. So thank you all to our panelists tonight for a wonderful discussion. Thank you once again to Mr. Nawar Singh and Devin for helping us have this program, or else without them, we wouldn't be able to have a successful discussion and program like tonight. So thank you once again to all of you. Thank you once again to our audience. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.